Welcome to Insights from Insight, the podcast, where we break down the science behind learning, well-being, and family life so that you can thrive, not just survive. I'm Amanda, and today's episode is for anyone who's ever felt like rest is a luxury they can't afford, especially if you're a mom, a caregiver, or just a human navigating the endless to-do list of modern life. We're talking about the power of pause, why rest is productive. I'm going to share my own story, but more importantly, we'll dig deep into the research and look at what science tells us about rest, decision fatigue, and why breaks are essential, not optional. Let's start with a truth. Moms everywhere are tired. Not just I need a nap tired, but deep in your bones, can't think straight, decision fatigue, sensory overload tired. Gen X women in particular grew up with the message that we could have it all. But what no one told us is that having it all often means doing it all with little support and even less rest. I know this exhaustion intimately. In my first marriage, I became the default adult, the one responsible for everything, by default, not by choice. My ex would come home, slip into some PJs, play with the kids or the dog, and that was the extent of his contribution to our home. The breaking point came when I was exclusively pumping for a 3-month-old. He was born with a cleft lip. So every 3 hours, day and night, I'd spend 45 minutes pumping and then another 45 minutes feeding the baby, all while caring for my 4-year-old and managing the household. My ex, who was unemployed at the time, did nothing to help. One night, desperate for just 1 hour of rest, I asked him to feed the baby. Instead of support, I was met with yelling and blame. And that was the moment I knew that I had to leave. Leaving didn't end the exhaustion. There were years of court battles, co-parenting nightmares, and simply surviving as a single mom, and it left me running on fumes. It wasn't until my now husband and I realized that I needed a real break, a true pause, that things began to shift. After 2 decades in public education, I resigned in June of 2024. Part of that decision was supporting my kids through their own trauma after the loss of their father, but the bigger part was finally giving myself permission to rest. And rest I did. I spent much of 2024 and a good chunk of 2025 asleep, and I'm not ashamed to say it. What's wild is that the pause didn't just heal my mind, it healed my body. My migraines are under control. I don't need monthly IVs anymore. My cholesterol and B12 are finally normal. I've had a couple of surgeries that I needed and that I actually recovered. I don't nap in the middle of the day, and I have energy to read, to play, to watch a whole movie with my kids, all because I dared to pause. But here's the thing. My story isn't unique, and it's not just about personal willpower. Research shows that chronic exhaustion isn't just a personal failing. It's a systemic issue, especially for women and mothers. So let's dig into the science and the research about what really happens to our brains and bodies when we don't rest. A 2021 study published in the Royal Society Open Science looked at decision fatigue in a real-world setting, and it was within the finance sector. And here's what they found. This study analyzed over 26,000 loan decisions by credit officers at a major bank. Approval rates dropped significantly around midday when fatigue was highest, and officers were more likely to reject loan restructuring proposals, the default least effort option, as decision fatigue set in. If all decisions had been made at early morning and well-rested levels, the bank would have gained an extra $509,000 in just 1 month. What does this mean for us? Decision fatigue isn't just about feeling tired. It leads to objectively worse decisions, lost opportunities, and real financial and emotional cost. When we're depleted, we default to what's easiest, not what's best. Let's talk about another domain, schools and healthcare. A 2024 meta-analysis synthesized 15 studies on classroom-based active breaks and their effects on students' attention. So here are their key findings. 1, active breaks have small but statistically significant positive effects on attention. This is the average effect size of 0.31. Secondly, the most effective interventions were with high school students, and their sessions lasting about 30 minutes and programs running for about 5 to 8 weeks. Third, activities with cognitive engagement like coordination or attention switching task and moderate to vigorous intensity yielded better outcomes than simple or purely just like physical activities, physical breaks. And the effectiveness of active breaks depends on the educational stage, the session length, and the cognitive demand. So, in other words, breaks aren't just a way to reset. They actually improve attention, learning, and executive function. And the more engaging and intentional the break, the bigger the benefit. When we look at research completed within the healthcare sphere, a study in 2020, which was an opinion piece in the BDJ in Practice, highlighting the critical need for breaks among dental professionals. So the statistics of note are that over 60% of UK dentists found it difficult to take short breaks, and 68% disagreed that regular rest is the norm. The consequences of insufficient breaks included emotional exhaustion, clinical errors. They were 28% attributed to exhaustion and 48% to lack of concentration, and also a compromised patient safety. So scheduled protected breaks improved morale, social connection, and provided opportunities for peer support and debriefing. So what all that means is that breaks aren't a luxury. They're a safety measure in both education and in healthcare. And lack of rest leads to more mistakes, worse outcomes, and burnout. So let's talk about sleep and trauma. A 2020 review found that sleep problems and trauma are deeply intertwined. Poor sleep increases vulnerability to stress and more trauma, and trauma often disrupts sleep. In fact, sleep disturbances are both a core symptom and a risk factor for developing PTSD. Here's the key takeaways of the 2020 review. Sleep, especially REM sleep, is critical for processing emotional memories. And poor sleep after trauma can lead to stronger, more persistent negative emotional memories, which impedes recovery from the trauma. And addressing sleep quality can accelerate trauma recovery and improve mental health outcomes. So what does all that mean for moms, especially those who've experienced trauma or periods of high stress? Prioritizing sleep and regular breaks isn't just about feeling better. It's about real, measurable improvements in resilience, emotional regulation, and recovery from adversity. And I do want to get specific about mothers in particular. During the COVID-19 pandemic, a lot of research was done about how people dealt with COVID-19 and the isolation. And one study in 2021 found that mothers in dual earner families took on most of the childcare, often by default and not by choice. So the key findings in this study was that mothers justified doing a disproportionate share of pandemic parenting as either practical because they had job flexibility, or who was breadwinner in the family, or it was remote work, or just natural internalized gender roles. The study also found that many didn't feel entitled to ask for more support, even when it was available. And there is always a guilt and cultural expectations that reinforce the idea that mothers should manage everything on their own. And even in non-traditional arrangements, unless couples explicitly rejected gendered norms, they often reverted to traditional roles over time. So why does this matter? It helps explain why so many women didn't return to the workforce. And it explains why fathers' involvement waned as the pandemic wore on, and why the toll on mothers' mental and physical health has been so severe. So let's pull all of this together. The science of all of this is super clear. Decision fatigue leads to objectively worse decisions and costly mistakes. Breaks and rest are not optional, and they're essential for learning, emotional regulation, and safety. Sleep is a cornerstone of trauma recovery and resilience building. And mothers, especially, are at risk of chronic depletion due to both structural and cultural forces. So what can you do? Here's a couple action steps for you. 1, prioritize your own breaks. Schedule them, protect them, and treat them as a non-negotiable. 2, challenge default roles. Have explicit conversation about the division of labor, and don't let practical or natural justifications go unexamined. Third, normalize asking for help, whether from partners, family, or outside caregivers. Fourth, advocate for systemic change. Push for policies that support rest, things like paid leave, flexible work, and childcare support. And finally, educate others. Share the research. The more people who understand the science, the more that we have an opportunity to shift culture. So here's your challenge this week, especially for moms. Find one moment, just one, to pause, breathe, and rest. And notice what changes. Maybe it's a 10-minute walk without the dog, just a walk for you, or a nap without guilt, or simply saying no to one more obligation. You might be surprised at the power that comes from simply daring to stop. And if you're a partner or friend to someone who's always on or who is the default person in the relationship, encourage them to take that pause. Advocate for breaks in your workplace, your family, and your community. We have to normalize rest. I know that a lot of Gen X exercise to the point of throwing up. You run until you puke, right? But rest isn't a weakness. It's the foundation for everything else. If you need permission to pause, consider it granted. Thanks for listening to this research-driven episode of Insights from Insight. And if you found this helpful, please share it with a friend, leave a review, send me your thoughts. I'd love to hear your story. And until next time, take care of yourself. And remember, sometimes the most productive thing you can do is to pause.